My name is Simone, and I was 34 years old the afternoon my mother sat across from me at her own kitchen table and told me my energy was too negative for the wedding aisle. Not my behavior. Not something I had done. My energy. Your energy is too negative for the aisle, she said. And then my father, who was standing at the counter pretending to look for something in a cabinet, added without turning around, "Sit with the distant cousins. It's better that way." I did not respond. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, set it down, and said I had to get back to work. What they did not know, and what I had never once thought to mention because no one had asked, was that the entire reception rested on something with my name attached to it. Not symbolically, legally, financially, in a way that a single phone call could unwind in under 4 minutes. I did not make that call immediately. I am not that kind of person. I went home, I sat with it, and I made a decision the way I make all my decisions, slowly, clearly, and only once I was certain. What happened 3 days before that wedding, and then what happened when the caterer's van pulled up and the groom's family started asking questions. I'm going to tell you all of it. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a house that had a lot of rules about how things looked from the outside. Not written rules. Nothing posted on the refrigerator. Just an understanding, absorbed so early I couldn't tell you when it started, that the family's presentation to the world was something that required constant tending, the way a garden requires constant tending, and that the tending was not distributed equally among the people who lived there. My parents, Carolyn and Frank, had been married for 38 years by the time my sister Jess got engaged. They were not a dramatic couple. They did not fight loudly or love loudly. They operated on a kind of low-frequency hum of mutual expectation, and the expectation, as far as I could observe it across 34 years of proximity, was this: that things would be managed, that managed things would look good, and that the people most capable of managing things would do so without requiring acknowledgement in return. I was the one who managed things. Jess was 3 years younger than me, and she was, and I mean this without sourness, genuinely easier to love in the way that some people are. She was warm in a way that was immediate, the kind of warm that made strangers feel known. She cried at commercials. She remembered birthdays without a calendar. She sent voice notes instead of texts. She was, by any reasonable measure, the emotional center of our family, and our family organized itself around that center in the way iron filings organize around a magnet, not by choice exactly, just by the nature of the field. I was not that. I was reliable. I was the one who drove my mother to her dental appointments and didn't mention it to anyone. I was the one who sorted out my parents' home insurance dispute 3 years ago when the adjuster was being evasive and my mother didn't know what questions to ask. I was the one who, when Jess had a difficult semester in college and needed to move home for 3 months, rearranged my own schedule to cover the things my parents couldn't cover while they readjusted the house around her. I want to be careful not to tell this as a story about resentment, because that is not quite what it is. I knew who I was in the family. I had made a kind of settlement with it a long time ago. What I had not made a settlement with was the assumption, held collectively, never examined, that being the one who managed things meant I had no feelings about how those things turned out. My professional life, by 34, was in corporate event production. I worked for a mid-sized firm based in Portland called Meridian Event Group, where I managed vendor relations, budget architecture, and contract negotiation for large-scale corporate events, product launches, multi-day conferences, annual company retreats. My specific area of expertise was catering and hospitality contracts, which in the world of large-scale event production is a more significant specialty than it sounds, because catering is almost always the largest single-line item in an event budget, and catering contracts are almost always the most complex documents in the vendor file. I knew how they worked. I knew what the clauses meant. I knew which protections mattered and which were boilerplate, and I knew exactly what happened when an authorized signatory withdrew their authorization. I had been doing this for 9 years. I was good at it in the way that comes not from natural gift but from repetition and careful attention, from having read enough contracts that the language stopped feeling like a foreign country and started feeling like a neighborhood, by heart. My anchor, the person in my family who saw me the way I actually was, rather than the way I was useful, was my father's mother, my grandmother Iris. Iris was 79. She had spent her working life as a paralegal in a small firm in Eugene, Oregon. And she had retired with the particular sharpness of someone whose brain had been trained on precision for 4 decades and had not gone soft in the years since. She lived alone in a small house she had owned outright since 1991. She had a garden, a cat named Gerald, and opinions she delivered without decoration. She had watched me my entire life with clear eyes. Not the eyes of someone who pitied me, or who thought I was hard done by, or who wanted to intervene. Just clear eyes. The kind that registered what was actually happening and held it without judgment. When I visited her, which I did most Sunday afternoons, she made coffee and asked direct questions and listened to the answers without filling the space with reassurance. She was the only person in my family who asked me, regularly, how I was, not as a social gesture but as a real inquiry, with a pause afterward that meant she was waiting to hear. I told Iris things I did not tell anyone else. Not because I confided easily, but because she was trustworthy in a specific way. She would not repeat it, she would not panic, and she would not do anything about it unless I asked her to. When Jess announced her engagement to a man named Derek at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in March, with champagne and a perfectly timed reveal of the ring while Derek stood by looking like a man who had rehearsed being nervous, I was genuinely happy for her. Derek was decent. He had a steadiness to him that I respected. He worked in commercial real estate and had a mother named Patricia who, within 40 minutes of the engagement announcement, had produced a notebook with a preliminary wedding timeline. Patricia was organized. I registered this immediately as a fact with implications. The wedding planning began in earnest about a month after the engagement, which meant it began in April, which meant the wedding was scheduled for the following June, 14 months out. This was, in my professional opinion, a reasonable runway for a wedding of the scale Jess and my mother had in mind, which was approximately 180 guests at a venue in the Pearl District of Portland that Jess had been looking at for 2 years. My involvement began not because I offered it but because Jess called me on a Wednesday evening and said, "Naughty, sorry, Simone, I need to talk to someone who knows about vendor contracts. Mom is excited, but she keeps agreeing to things without reading the fine print, and I'm scared we're going to end up locked into something bad." "Send me what you have," I said. She sent me 4 documents. I spent an evening reading them. One of them had a clause that would have cost the family $14,000 in non-refundable deposits if the guest count dropped below a minimum threshold that was almost certainly unreachable given the venue's layout constraints. I called Jess the next morning and told her. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Can you just handle this part? Please." "I can," I said. That was the first agreement, the first of many. Over the following 14 months, I negotiated and executed the catering contract for the wedding reception, $47,000 across a full-plated dinner service for 182 guests, a cocktail hour with past appetizers, a dessert station, staffing, equipment rental, and a late-night snack setup that Jess had seen at a friend's wedding and decided was essential. The caterer was a firm called Larkspur Provisions, with whom I had a professional relationship that predated this engagement by 6 years. My contact there was a man named Ben who was the operations director and who I had worked with on 4 corporate events. Ben knew me. Ben knew my professional history. Ben's team did exceptional work, and the rate I negotiated was 17% below their standard wedding pricing because of the relationship and because I knew which line items had margin. My name was on the contract as the authorized client contact and sole signatory. This was not unusual for my professional engagements. It was simply how the paperwork was structured, and no one in my family had ever looked at the paperwork closely enough to have an opinion about it. I paid the deposits in 3 installments from my personal account, not as a gift, but as a float, with the understanding that my parents and Derek's family would reimburse as the budget was settled. This arrangement was informal. We had not put it in writing. I had not asked for a written agreement because it had not, at the time, seemed necessary. I want to note that it had not seemed necessary. I would think about that later. Beyond the catering, I had also, at various points as problems arose, renegotiated the venue's service agreement when the event coordinator changed mid-planning and the new coordinator tried to introduce additional fees. I had sourced and vetted the transportation company handling the shuttle service between the venue and the hotel block. I had drafted the vendor communication schedule that kept the day of timeline functional. I had done all of this as quietly as I did everything, without announcement, without a running tally of favors, because this was what I did, and because it needed to be done, and because I was, as I had always been, the one who could do it. Jess knew I was involved. My mother knew I was involved. My father knew in the vague way that men who don't handle these things know, aware that something was happening, grateful it wasn't requiring his attention. Patricia knew I was involved. She had been on several of the vendor calls, and she had a sharp enough mind to understand that the rate we were getting from Larkspur Provisions was not a rate that came from luck. She had said to me, once at a venue walkthrough, "You clearly know what you're doing. Jess is lucky to have you on this." It was a professional compliment, delivered professionally. I had said thank you and moved on to the next item on the agenda. That was the world as it stood in the late spring, about 6 weeks before the wedding. Then the bridesmaid conversation happened. I had been a bridesmaid in the working assumption for months. Not officially. Jess had never formally asked me. There had been no proposal moment, no bridesmaid box with a card and a candle and a question. But I had been included in the bridesmaid group chat since February. I had been part of the dress shopping trip in January, though I had deferred on the opinion giving because I knew the decision wasn't mine to make. I had attended the bridesmaid brunch that Patricia's family hosted in March, where the 5 confirmed bridesmaids, Jess's college roommate, her 2 closest work friends, Derek's sister, and a cousin from my mother's side, had all been present, and I had been present, and no one had said anything that suggested I was there in a different category. I assumed. I know that now. I assumed, and the assumption was wrong, and the way I found out it was wrong was not a conversation but a reorganization that had apparently already happened before I was informed of it. The call came on a Thursday evening, about 5 weeks before the wedding. Jess. Her voice had the particular cadence of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say enough times that the rehearsal has started to show. "So we've been thinking about the wedding party lineup," she said, "and Derek's family has a lot of people in from out of state, and his mom suggested that the processional would photograph better if it was more symmetrical. He has 4 groomsmen, so 4 bridesmaids, and right now there are 5 on my side, and it made sense to even it out." I said nothing. And everyone agreed that since you're basically running the logistics side of things, like you're more important as the coordinator than as a bridesmaid, it made more sense for you to be available during the processional to handle any vendor check-ins that come up. I recognized this framing. I had used a version of it myself, professionally, when I needed to restructure a team assignment in a way that someone might resist. You give the person you're removing a more important role. You make the removal sound like an elevation. "Okay," I said. "Who's the 4th bridesmaid?" A half-second pause. "We asked Kelsey. Derek's cousin. She's going to fly in from Scottsdale." Kelsey, whom I had never met, from Scottsdale, was now in the wedding party in my place because the processional would photograph more symmetrically. "That makes sense," I said. "You're not upset?" "I didn't say that." A longer pause. "Simone. I have an early morning tomorrow, Jess. I'll talk to you this weekend." I ended the call. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that, not doing anything in particular, looking at the corner of my living room where the natural light hit the wall at a certain angle in the evenings and made the paint look warmer than it was. My hands were cold, which sometimes happened when I was processing something, and I pressed them flat on my thighs and let them be cold. The following Sunday, I went to see Iris. She was in the garden when I arrived, doing something to a rose bush that involved a small pair of shears and a level of concentration she usually reserved for legal documents. She looked up when she heard the gate, gave me a nod, and went back to the rose bush. I sat on the garden bench and waited. When she was satisfied, she put the shears down, pulled off her gloves, and said, "Tell me." I told her. She listened with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, which was her listening posture. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And your name is still on the catering contract," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Sole signatory." "Yes." She nodded very slowly. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I need to think about it." "Don't decide in this mood," she said. "Decide when you're steady." I told her I would. The second blow came not from Jess but from my parents, and it came 8 days later, which was a Saturday, at the family house. My mother had asked me to come over for lunch. ostensibly to go over the day of timeline, which I had drafted and which she wanted to review. I came. I sat at the kitchen table where I had sat 10,000 times before. My father was there. There was bread and soup, and everything was ordinary. After about 20 minutes, when we had gone through the timeline and I had answered my mother's questions about the shuttle schedule and the appetizer service window, my mother put down her pen and said, in a tone that was trying to be gentle and landing somewhere more clinical, "We also wanted to talk to you about the seating." I looked at her. Patricia had a thought, and we agreed with it, honestly, that since you're going to be doing a lot of moving around during the reception anyway, handling things, it might be less disruptive if you were seated somewhere flexible, toward the back, near the exits, so you can get in and out without disturbing people. Table placement shouldn't matter if I'm moving around, I said. My mother looked at my father. My father said, "We put you at a table with some of the family from out of town. The Hendersons. Your Uncle Ray's people." Uncle Ray's people were people I had met twice. Your energy, and I'm not trying to be unkind, but your energy can be a little heavy at things like this, my mother said. Patricia noticed it at the venue walkthrough. She mentioned that the front-of-house tables should be people who are going to bring the room up. There it was. I looked at my mother. My mother looked back at me with an expression that was a negotiation, asking me to accept the framing, to not make it complicated, to be the person who absorbs things and moves on. Your energy is too negative for the aisle, she said. I know that sounds harsh, but I'd rather be honest with you than have you feel blindsided on the day. My father, still not quite looking at me, said, "Sit with the distant cousins. It's better that way." Something went quiet in my chest. Not warm quiet, cold quiet. The kind that happens when you've been taking in information for a long time and your system finally processes all of it at once. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, set it down. "Okay," I said. "I have to get back to work." My mother looked slightly surprised. She had possibly expected resistance, or tears, or a negotiation. I gave her none of those things. I picked up my bag, kissed her on the cheek because I am the kind of person who does that even when it costs something, and I left. In the car, I sat for 3 minutes before I started the engine. I looked at the steering wheel. I thought about the catering contract. I thought about the clause I had specifically negotiated into it, the authorized signatory withdrawal clause, which I had included because I always included it in personal contracts, because 9 years in event production had taught me that circumstances change, and you want a clean exit mechanism in writing when they do. I thought about Ben at Larkspur Provisions, who would pick up on the second ring. I did not call him that day, or the next, or the day after that. I made myself wait. I made myself be steady, the way Iris had said. I went to work. I finished a contract negotiation for a corporate client. I went running 3 mornings in a row along the river path. I had dinner with a friend who did not know any of the people in this story, and who made me laugh about something unrelated for 2 hours, which was the most useful thing that happened that entire week. 3 days before the wedding, I was steady. I made the call. It was a Wednesday morning. I called Ben at Larkspur Provisions at 8:15 when I knew he would be in the office and before the day's logistics had complicated his availability. He picked up on the second ring, as I had known he would. "Simone," he said, "what do you need?" "I need to walk through the authorized contact status on the Carmichael Walsh wedding," I said. "I want to make sure everything is current." "Sure," he said. I heard him pull up the file. "You're the sole signatory on the account. Authorized contact for all confirmations, changes, and day of coordination." "Right," I said. "I need to withdraw my authorization and suspend the service agreement pending account transfer." A pause. Not a long one. Ben had been in this business long enough that nothing surprised him procedurally. But a pause. "You're withdrawing authorization," he said. "Yes." Under Clause 7 of the service agreement, the authorized signatory can suspend or withdraw pending a formal account transfer or dispute resolution. "I'd like to invoke that, Simone." His voice was careful. "This is a 3-day-out situation. I can't hold the order once it's in prep." "I understand," I said. "I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm invoking my contractual right. What I'd suggest is that someone from the client family contacts you directly to establish a new authorized signatory and confirm the service. If that happens before your prep deadline, you proceed as normal. Another pause. I'll need it in writing from you. I'll send it within the hour, I said. Okay, he said. And then, with the tact of someone who has navigated other people's family situations more times than he could count, I hope it works out. Thank you, Ben, I said. I appreciate you. I sent the email at 9:02. Then I went to work. I did not call Jess. I did not call my mother. I did not explain, warn, or announce. The contract was mine to manage. I had managed it. What happened next was an administrative matter between Larkspur Provisions and whoever in the family could produce an authorized signatory in the next 72 hours. I thought about that for a moment, whether there was anyone in the family who could do that, who knew the contract terms, who had a relationship with Ben, who understood what an authorized signatory even meant in this context. I sat with that thought. Then I got on with my day. I went to the wedding. I want to be clear about that because I think there might be an expectation that I stayed home, that I made my absence a statement, that I refused to participate in the day. That is not what I did. I drove to the venue on a Saturday morning in June. I wore a navy dress that fit well and cost what it cost. I arrived at the venue, a restored warehouse space in Portland's Pearl District called the Aldern, which I had walked through 4 times in the planning process and which was genuinely beautiful, all exposed brick and warm pendant lighting, at 11:30 in the morning. I was there because I had helped build the day. I had a right to be there. And I was there because Iris had said to me the night before when I'd called her, "You go. You sit where they put you. And you let the day happen." That is what I intended to do. The morning setup was underway when I arrived. The florist team was working on the ceremony arch. The lighting company was doing a final check on the reception hall fixtures. The venue coordinator, a composed woman named Adele who I had spoken to probably 40 times over the previous year, saw me in the corridor and gave me a nod that held a question. "You're not coordinating today?" she said. "I'm a guest today," I said. She looked at me for a half-second longer than necessary, then said, "Understood," and went back to her clipboard. My family arrived in clusters through the late morning. Jess was getting ready in the bridal suite with the 4 bridesmaids, Kelsey from Scottsdale among them, whom I glimpsed briefly in the corridor and who appeared perfectly pleasant and entirely unaware of the geometry she had been placed into. My mother swept through the main hall in a rose gold dress, directing things in the vague way of someone who wanted to feel like they were running an operation without having to actually run one. My father found me in the reception hall while the chairs were being arranged for the cocktail hour. He gave me a hug that was slightly stiffer than usual and said, "You look nice." I said thank you. Patricia arrived at noon, with Derek's family in a coordinated cluster. She was in a structured cream suit and moved through the venue with the confident efficiency of someone who had attended many events and understood how to assess a room quickly. She found me at the side of the reception hall, where I had stationed myself with a glass of water, and said, "Simone, I'm so glad you're here." Her tone was warm and genuine, and I believed it. I had always found Patricia to be a person of actual warmth, whatever the effects of her organizational preferences had been. "Congratulations on Derek," I said. "He looks very happy." "He is," she said. She looked at me for a moment, a longer look than a social look, the look of someone doing a calculation. Then she moved on. The ceremony was at 2:00. I took my seat in the main hall, not at the back because the ceremony seating was open, and I chose a row toward the middle in the aisle seat, which I did because I always chose aisle seats at events out of professional habit. I watched my sister walk down the aisle on my father's arm. She was incandescent. I mean that precisely. She was one of those people who, on important days, seem to generate their own light, and today she had it fully. Derek watched her walk toward him with an expression that was completely unguarded, and I thought, regardless of everything else, this part is right. The ceremony was 35 minutes. The officiant was a friend of theirs who had clearly prepared carefully and made 2 people in the row in front of me cry during the vows. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched and felt the particular complexity of loving someone and being diminished by them at the same time. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, things began to move. The cocktail hour was in the Aldern's courtyard, a paved outdoor space with string lights and a bar setup that one of the venue's in-house vendors was handling. The past appetizers were supposed to arrive from Larkspur at 4:15 to be served during the cocktail hour before the reception dinner began at 5:30. At 4:25, there were no appetizers. I was standing near the edge of the courtyard with a glass of wine, speaking with one of Derek's college friends who turned out to work in supply chain management and who had thoughts about vendor logistics that I found genuinely interesting, when I noticed my mother moving through the crowd with a particular quality of movement. Not fast, not panicked, but purposeful in a way that only happens when something has gone wrong, and she was trying to contain it before it spread. She disappeared into the interior of the venue. I stayed where I was and continued the conversation about supply chain logistics. At 4:40, there were still no appetizers. The bar was doing well. People had drinks, people were talking, the ambient noise of a happy gathering was fully established. But the catering staff that should have been circulating with trays was not circulating. And I could see, from my position at the edge of the courtyard, that Adele, the venue coordinator, had joined my mother inside, and that my father had also been drawn into whatever conversation was happening. At 4:55, Jess appeared at the edge of the courtyard in her dress, which meant she had left the bridal suite, which meant something had happened that she had been told about, and which had crossed the threshold of being manageable without her. I took a sip of my wine. Her eyes found me across the courtyard. She started walking toward me. Her face was doing something complicated, the particular configuration of someone who is trying very hard to be calm and is not entirely succeeding, the muscles around her jaw tight, her breath visible in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. She stopped in front of me. "Simone," she said.
"Hi," I said.
"The caterer hasn't arrived," she said. "Okay," I said. "There's Adele called Ben, the operations director at Larkspur, and he said there's an issue with the authorized signatory on the account," and she stopped.
Took a breath.
Is there something going on with the contract?" "Yes," I said.
She looked at me.
I looked at her. "Why didn't you tell us?" she said.
"You didn't ask," I said.
Her throat moved. Behind her, I could see my mother and father emerging from the venue interior into the courtyard. Behind them, Patricia. Behind Patricia, Randolph, Derek's father, who was a solid, deliberate man who I had interacted with twice and who had the bearing of someone who was very good at remaining composed and was currently working harder than usual to do so. They were all moving toward us, and the space around Jess and me was becoming a cluster, the kind that forms at events when something has gone wrong and people are trying to solve it without making the guests aware that something has gone wrong. Randolph reached us first. He looked at me with a directness I respected. "You're Simone," he said. "Yes," I said. "You're the authorized contact on the catering account." "I am." His jaw shifted slightly. "What does it take to resolve this?" The next part happened in the venue's interior, in the coordinator's office, just off the main reception hall, a small room with a round table and 4 chairs, and a window that looked out on the parking area. Adele had suggested moving the conversation inside, which was the right call. About 30 people in the courtyard had not yet registered that anything was wrong, and keeping it that way for as long as possible was in everyone's interest. The people in the room: me, Jess, my mother, my father, Patricia, Randolph, and Adele. Adele had her laptop open and a printed copy of the Larkspur contract on the table. She had pulled it from the venue's vendor file, where I had deposited a copy at the venue walkthrough 3 months ago, because I always left a copy with the venue coordinator. Standard practice. Ben was on speakerphone. His voice was calm, even, and impeccably neutral, the voice of someone who has been in complicated situations before and knows his only job is to be accurate. Randolph had positioned himself as the person who was going to resolve this. I understood that. He was the kind of man who stepped into the center of a problem and addressed it directly, and I had no objection to that. I sat in one of the 4 chairs. My mother was standing near the door. My father had his arms folded and his eyes on the table. Randolph said, "Ben, what does the account resolution require?" Ben said, "The service agreement names Simone Okafor as the sole authorized signatory and client of record on the Carmichael Walsh catering account. She submitted a written withdrawal of authorization on Wednesday morning, invoking Clause 7 of the service agreement. Under that clause, Service is suspended until either a new authorized signatory is established with a vendor or the original signatory reinstates authorization. No one from the client family has contacted us to establish a new signatory, and we haven't received a reinstatement from Simone. Silence. Randolph looked at me. You withdrew authorization 3 days ago. Yes, I said.
Why?
I held his gaze. I was removed from the wedding party and seated at a table with people I've met twice, and my mother told me my energy was too negative for the aisle. I made a business decision. The room was very still. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Not in a dramatic way, a small, reflexive movement, the kind that happens before the body catches up with the event. My father's arms unfolded. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. Jess was standing beside me, and I did not look at her, but I was aware of her breathing changing, a slight catch, a recalibration. Patricia looked at Randolph. Something passed between them that I was not meant to see but saw anyway, a spousal shorthand, a question asked and answered without words, and the answer was not comfortable. Randolph looked back at me. His expression was steady. He was recalibrating, but he was doing it with discipline. The $47,000 in deposits, he said. Those ran through your account. Yes, I said. I negotiated the contract using my professional vendor relationships, which is how we got the rate we did. The deposits were fronted through my personal account with the understanding that the family would settle the budget. That conversation was never formalized in writing. He nodded slowly.
He was doing the math.
I could see him doing it. So the caterer, he said, will not arrive without your say-so. That's correct. And the $47,000 in deposits is also, currently, technically your money. Also correct. A longer pause. Randolph looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at my mother. My mother was not looking at anything. Her eyes were somewhere in the middle distance, and her hand had dropped from her mouth, and something in her face had rearranged into an expression I had not seen from her before. Something past surprise, something that was trying to be remorse, and hadn't quite assembled itself into that shape yet. My father said quietly, Simone. Just my name. Nothing attached to it. But the way he said it, the particular weight of a single word from a man who doesn't use many, landed differently than I expected. Ben's voice came through the speaker. I do want to note that we have the order fully prepped and can dispatch within 40 minutes of receiving reinstatement of authorization. We anticipated this might be resolved today. Randolph said, Can we give you 5 minutes, Ben? Of course, Ben said. Randolph looked at me. Tell me what you need, he said. I had thought about this. In the days since Wednesday, I had thought about exactly this moment and what I wanted to do with it. I am not a person who uses leverage to punish. I did not want to ruin my sister's wedding. I did not want the guests in the courtyard to go without dinner. I did not want Jess to carry the weight of my family's failure to her for the rest of her life. What I wanted was to be seen, accurately and on record. I need 3 things, I said. 1. The deposits are settled with me in writing within 30 days, in the full amount, regardless of whatever budget conversations happen internally. 2. The family acknowledges, also in writing, an email is sufficient, that I managed and executed the vendor contracts for this wedding, and that the event ran on my professional relationships. 3. I want a seat at the family table for dinner.
The room was quiet. Randolph said, Done.
All 3. He looked at my mother when he said it.
Not at me.
At my mother. My mother's throat moved. She looked at me and said, in a voice that was quieter than her normal voice, You should have been at the family table from the beginning. I looked at her for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Ben. Ben, I said. You're reinstated. Same terms, same timeline. Dispatch when you're ready. Copy that, Ben said. 40 minutes. I ended the call. I stood up. I set my phone in my bag. I looked at Adele, who had been sitting at the edge of the table with the composure of a woman who had witnessed more than this in her career. 40 minutes, I said to her. You'll want to push the cocktail hour by 30 and notify the kitchen.
Already on it, she said.
She closed her laptop with a click that had the quality of a period at the end of a sentence. I walked out of the coordinator's office and back into the corridor and out through the side door into the courtyard, where the guests were on their third drinks, and the string lights had come on in the early evening gold of a June day in Portland, and no one had noticed anything at all. I found my glass of wine, where I had left it on a high-top table near the edge of the space. I picked it up. I looked at the lights. The appetizers arrived at 5:42. Larkspur's team moved through the Alderton with the efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. White shirt servers with trays, the warm smell of something good coming from the direction of the kitchen corridor, Adele's staff pivoting smoothly from the delayed schedule, as if it had always been the plan. The cocktail hour extended another 20 minutes, which in practice meant the guests had more time with their drinks, and the ambient energy of the reception, which had been building well regardless, found another level. By the time the dinner service began at 6:15, everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. Larkspur set a beautiful table. The plated dinner was what I had negotiated, 3 courses, clean and generous, the kind of meal that gets complimented. Ben's team did not miss a step. I was seated at the family table. Adele had personally adjusted the seating arrangement before the dinner service began. She did it without ceremony, moved the card, reset the place setting, and when I came into the reception hall and saw where my seat was, I stood there for a moment and looked at it. Then I sat down. Randolph and Patricia were on one side of the table, my parents on the other, Jess and Derek at the center. There was a seat between my mother and my Aunt Linda, and that was where my card was, and I sat in it, and my mother looked at me when I sat down and said nothing, and I looked back at her and said nothing, and we both reached for our water glasses at approximately the same moment, which under other circumstances might have been funny. The dinner was good. I ate my food. I responded when spoken to. Derek's youngest brother, who was 17 and had been seated at our table in a burst of optimistic inter-family integration, turned out to have opinions about Pacific Northwest hiking trails that I found genuinely engaging, and we talked about the Timberline Lodge area for longer than either of us probably expected. The speeches were after the second course. Derek's best man gave a speech that was warm and only slightly too long. Jess's college roommate gave one that made the room laugh 3 times, and Jess cry once. My father gave a brief, careful speech about watching Jess grow up, and at the end of it he looked in my direction for a moment. Not long, not a significant gesture, just a glance, and it was enough. Patricia came to my seat during the dessert course. She did not sit. She stood beside my chair and spoke quietly enough that it was between us. Randolph told me the full picture tonight, she said. I want you to know, the photo decision, the processional, those were my suggestions. I thought I was streamlining the aesthetics. I didn't understand the full context of your role. You didn't have the full information, I said. No, she said. And I should have asked for it. She paused. You negotiated a remarkable rate from Larkspur. I looked it up after. Their standard wedding pricing is considerably higher. I've known Ben for 6 years, I said. She nodded. Then she said, I'd like to send a proper thank you. Would that be all right? It would, I said. She went back to her seat. Jess came to me near the end of the reception, when the dance floor was full and the overhead lights had been dimmed and the evening had the particular texture of an event winding down well. She came without her wedding party, without Derek, without an audience. She sat in the empty chair beside me. Derek's brother had been absorbed into the dance floor, and she put her hand in her lap and looked at the table. I didn't know you'd withdrawn the contract, she said. I mean, I should have. I should have known what could happen when she stopped. You were planning a wedding, I said. That's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It isn't. She looked up at me. Her eye makeup had held beautifully all day and was now, finally, beginning to fail slightly at the outer corners, which gave her face a softness that was different from the precision of the ceremony look. I need you to know that the bridesmaid thing, the photo thing, I let Derek's mom steer me because I wanted her to be happy with the wedding. And I was wrong to let it go that far. You deserved better than that. I looked at my sister. I know you love me, I said. I've always known that. That's not enough on its own, she said. No, I said. It isn't, but it's somewhere to start from. She put her hand over mine on the table, the way someone does when they're trying to hold something they've come close to losing. I let her hand stay there. My mother found me at the coat check at the end of the night. She was carrying her wrap and her clutch, and the expression of someone who had been thinking hard for several hours and was still not done. She did not hug me immediately, which was actually more honest than if she had. She stood in front of me and looked at me, really looked, in the way she had not often done. "Your grandmother called me tonight," she said. "She called from home. She said she wanted me to look at what you'd built for this family and actually see it." I was quiet. "She said she'd been trying to tell us that for years," my mother said, in her way. That landed somewhere in me that I didn't try to name.
"She's not wrong," I said.
My mother nodded. She looked like she was carrying something heavy and was deciding whether to put it down. "I'm sorry about the aisle," she said. "I'm sorry about the cousins' table. We were trying to manage Patricia's preferences, and we managed them at your expense, and that was wrong." "Yes," I said. "It was." She looked at me with something in her eyes that was not guilt anymore, but was something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that a door had been left open for a long time that should have been closed, and the person it was left open toward had simply eventually stopped walking through it, and they had not noticed until now. "I'd like to do better," she said. "I'd like that too," I said. I hugged her then. It was a real hug, not performed, not resolved, just real. The kind you give when you're not past something yet, but you've decided to walk in the same direction. I drove home through Portland on a June night with the windows down a little, and the city doing what it does. Wet and lit and indifferent and beautiful. I had the radio on low, something instrumental, and I drove the 45 blocks between the Alderton and my apartment without thinking about anything in particular. Just driving. Just the road and the lights and the particular quiet of having spent a lot of emotional energy and being, finally, past the place where it was required. I parked. I went upstairs. I took off the navy dress and hung it up and put on the oversized shirt I wore around the apartment and made a cup of chamomile because my body had decided it was done with stimulants for the day. I stood at the kitchen window. Portland at 11:15 on a Saturday had a certain quality. The rain smell, even when it wasn't raining, the warm glow from the bars 3 blocks over, the particular silence of a neighborhood that is never fully quiet. I called Iris. She picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" she said. "It went," I said. A pause. "Good enough." I thought about it. The family table. Jess's hand over mine. My mother's face at the coat check. Ben's team setting a beautiful dinner for 182 people at 6:15. "Good enough," I said. "Good," she said. And then, "Get some sleep." I told her I would. Here is what I know. The people who hold things together are often the last ones thanked for the holding. Not because no one noticed, sometimes they noticed very clearly, but because noticing and acknowledging are 2 different skills, and not everyone has both. What I also know is this: a contract is a document of trust. When you put your name on something, you are saying, "I will stand behind this." And if the people around you forget what that means, there is always a clause for that too. That's my story. A catering contract, a phone call made on a Wednesday morning, and a seat at the family table. Have you ever quietly made something possible for someone, an event, a plan, a whole day, and only been acknowledged for it when the alternative was things falling apart? How did you handle that moment when it came? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.